Okay, we're going to take a look at the game Wilderness Campaign, made by SPI in 1973. And this is somewhat of a personal favorite of mine. Even though the graphics aren't up to today's standards, it's a very fine game. And I'm sure this video will not do the game justice. The game just, you need to play it to really sort of unlock its treasures. But let's take a look at the map and components first. Now that's an overall look at the map. We'll be zooming in a moment. Up to the north here you can see the Washington area. Down here is the Richmond-Petersburg area. Now the map, I guess, is a graphic dinosaur compared to today's standards. It's only like a 3-color process. You've got a dark blue, a light blue, and some gray. So it's not up to today's standards graphically, but who cares? It's a great game. So let's zoom in on the map itself. Okay, there you have the Washington City area with the city of Alexandria to the south and the fortifications outside the city. And you see Harper's Ferry there, and we'll go down the railroad a little bit down to Winchester. And over to the west, Strasburg. You can see the Shenandoah Valley Mountains there. We'll travel east along the railroad, and we'll come to the historic Manassas Junction. Now you can see there Culpeper Courthouse, Clark's Mountain, and Rapidan Station. That's where the campaign is going to begin. Now we'll follow just east a little bit there along the Rappahannock-Rapidan, and you can see the historic Fredericksburg there, where a battle was fought there in 1862. You can see Spotsylvania Courthouse, continuing down the railroad to Hanover Junction, and eventually you would come to the outer defenses of Richmond, Yellow Tavern, fortifications there of Richmond, and down to Bermuda 100 and Petersburg. You can also see City Point. We'll zoom out there and get a view from a little bit higher up. Now, towards the end of the game, the battle is going to kind of revolve around the capture of Richmond, of course. So the area we're looking at now is going to be the very critical area near the end of the scenario. Okay, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to show you some of the units. Now the Union units in this game are core level. So there's we'll say the 6th Corps 10-6. And the Confederate units are division level. So there's a typical Confederate division of 4-6. Now the Confederate cavalry brigades are 1-7s, and the Union cavalries are also 1-7s, although they actually represent a cavalry division. So that's what the units look like, using standard NATO symbols. They were very basic, but they were certainly functional. There's the Robert E. Lee counter, showing his combat value of 10 when involved in the combat. And we've got General Grant here, also a 10. So let's take a look at how the movement system worked. Okay, what you see before you is a typical move. This isn't an optimum move or anything like that, but this is what the game kind of looks like when you're playing it. Now most of the time the units are upside down, and you use your cavalry to reconnoiter the enemy and find out what the units are. Also, another natural state of the units is to be entrenched. Now this game has the easiest entrenchment rules that I've ever seen, and you know, the best I've ever seen too. You know how most games you spend an entire turn to entrench a unit, or he spends all his movement points, stuff like that. This game has got the cheapest method of making entrenchments that I've ever seen. For example, this Confederate, let's say 4-6 unit, all it has to do is spend 1 movement point to entrench itself. Oh, it's like a stack of dummies here. Anyway, we'll get to that. Entrenching is very inexpensive. Only 1 single movement point and you're entrenched. So Confederate units that move 6, they often find themselves moving 5 on their 6th movement point, entrenching, which is something you want to do in this game. But how does the cavalry reconnaissance work? Well, it works like this. For one, It costs 2 movement points to enter the zone of control of an enemy unit. So this Union Cavalry Division would pay 1 to enter the hexagon and 2 more to enter the zone of control for an expenditure of 3. It would then roll on a cavalry probe table, and if it rolls a 5 or 6, it fails at finding out what the strength of that unit is. Now let's say, for the sake of argument, the Union got a good roll. He rolled a 1 on the table, and the probe is successful. So we remove the entrenchment here, take a look, and lo and behold, we've got 3 dummy counters. So the Confederate player was trying to bluff him out. Now because he's successful and found only dummy counters, he may continue moving. So he spent, 3 movement points there. So he could go 4, 2 more to enter the zone of control, 5, 6. He spent 6 movement points, and he can now try to reconnoiter that square, which he doesn't know what it is. He knows that there's several, maybe dummy or real units under there, entrenched, and there's a cavalry unit on top of it. Now when you reconnoiter an enemy cavalry space, or that has cavalry in it, you have to add 2 to the dice. So for the sake of argument, let's say the Union player rolls the die, and what does he get? He rolls a 5. Adding 2 to that's a 7, which means he fails. So that cavalry division's turn is over, and he has not identified what is in those spaces. Now, another neat thing about cavalry is how they screen infantry, because friendly cavalry units also negate zones of control. So you remember how there was a zone of control there at one time, which cost 2 movement points to enter. Now it's gone because this cavalry unit is screening it. So this Union Corps here, or is it a corps? He doesn't know that. It might be a dummy. Can now move through that cavalry unit because it's being screened. So here's a typical move. Union Corps pay 1 to stack and unstack because they are corps. They are large units, so you're representing the wagon trains, things like that. So this corps spends 1 movement point to unstack, 2 to enter that zone of control. Remember, there's no zone of control there now. 1 more to cross the Pamunkey River. So that's 3. Then 4 to go there. And he can keep on going, let's say, to Hanover Junction, 5. And he decides to stop, and he spends a movement point to entrench. So you can see how the cavalry is very valuable for screening infantry units. Now let's say Grant orders this corps, and he goes down and goes 1, 2 to cross, 3, 4, 5, stack, and 1 to entrench. So Grant has got 2 corps firmly across Lee's line of communications there at Hanover Junction. And I want to point out that that isn't necessarily a good position for the Confederates to be in. It's just a move to show you how the cavalry works. So I'm going to reset up the positions again and show you some other moves that you can do. Okay, now there's another typical situation that might exist in a game. We've got Lee's army here stretched across or below the Pamunkey River with Grant's army moving in. Now let's say, for the sake of argument, it's the Confederate turn, and the Confederate decides he wants to reconnoiter that Union Corps or a dummy out there. So he spends 1 movement point to move there, spends another movement point to cross the Pamunkey, 2, and another one, 3. You say, wait a minute, what about the zone of control there? Well, zones of control don't extend across rivers, so it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because he's got to pay the zone of control cost for that. The Confederate unit would now roll on the probe table, and he rolls a 4, which is successful. So we flip the unit over, and lo and behold, the Confederate discovers the 6th Corps, 12-6. So that's how cavalry works. Again, just another illustration of how it does so. Lee and Grant, by the way, are very important in the game. They don't look like much. They're very basic counters. They add 10 to the combat value if they are attacked in a stack, but their main function is to get the movement of the armies more efficient. Their command control radius is virtually just 2 hexes, so Grant and Lee will always be within 2 hexes of their primary forces. So the game becomes a series of Grant outflanking Lee and maneuvering, trying to get outside Richmond. And I'll show you a typical position outside Richmond after the initial wilderness part of the campaign goes. Each turn represents 2 days, so you start the game up here at Culpeper Courthouse, and you can simulate the time scale is fairly good. You can outflank Lee and get down to Hanover Junction and stuff, maybe fight the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. It takes about a week, maybe. So the time scale is about right. But let's take a look at some of the positions, what they might look like as Grant approaches Richmond. Now there's a typical position as Grant pins Lee against Richmond. You can see Grant's lines getting longer and longer, as are Lee's. And this, of course, causes command control problems for both Lee and Grant, because Grant can't put in command control all of his units. Neither can Lee. You can see the command control, remember, only goes out to 2 squares. When you're out of command, you have to roll a die for movement, so it becomes rather chancy. Now, at this stage of the game, the Confederates are always fortifying, so that would be something they would do here. They'd be fortifying. There's also provision for Union naval movement, and Grant can move in units from port to port, so you can often see a case where Benjamin Butler's army might land here at Bermuda Hundred or City Point and cause Lee even more grief. So these lines get longer and longer, and Lee is forced to stretch his line even further to protect Petersburg, mimicking the actual siege, of course. Now I'll set up a position to show something like what the historical situation was like. Now there before you is kind of the situation that Grant did in the actual campaign. He moved his army south of the James River and began to invest Petersburg from the south. And that's how the campaign was won historically. Eventually he was able to extend his army further west and west and west until he finally snapped off 2 railroads, and Lee had to abandon Richmond, essentially, retreat west to Appomattox Courthouse, of course, where the war ended in the east. That's just over to the west there. I don't know if I can show that. Appomattox Courthouse, yeah, is there. So this part of the game is as exciting as the early stages for some reason. It looks like siege warfare, and that's exactly what it is. But it's very interesting. Now, one thing I should point out about this game is that it's almost hopeless to play solitaire. You really can't play this game solitaire, because the hidden combat strength aspect of the game is so integral to the game, so important to the game, and bluffing, that is, in essence, the game itself. So I just wouldn't recommend it for solitaire play. It really shines as a 2-player hidden movement game. I don't know what else to say about it, except I like it very much. It's one of my favorite Civil War games. And I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of how the game works. But a video certainly doesn't do the game justice. Now that's a typical position I've seen also, where Grant's lines are very long, stretching from north of Richmond all the way down to Petersburg practically. And Lee's lines, of course, are stretched very thin. Now with the limited intelligence for Grant and Lee, you're wondering, well, is that stacked 2 divisions? Or is that a division and a dummy? Or is that 2 dummies? Shall I assault? Maybe risk those horrendous casualties. So it becomes a cat and mouse game, and a lot of it's still maneuvering, but different kinds of maneuvering, with the trench lines only yards apart. Now the lifeline to Richmond, as we all know, are the rail lines here south of Petersburg. Once these are cut, or if they are cut, Lee's army is in big trouble, and that's what actually ended the war. When Grant was able to cut these 3 lines to Petersburg, Lee's army had to retreat west, give up the city, and eventually was cornered there at Appomattox Courthouse, way over here. So the end game of this game is very exciting. It's just a great game. I'm going to show you some other aspects of the game that I like, and we'll take a look at those. Rail movement was quite important in the Civil War, and you've got a couple of these nifty little rail counters which can whisk units hundreds of miles in 2 days. So they work kind of neat. The Union has more capacity than the Confederate, but they work kind of neat. Let's say you've got a unit here at Norfolk, Virginia. See, a Confederate division. And if it wants to embark on a train, you just pull out the rail counter, announce that you're embarking, and then you can move 8 times as fast from your moving factor. So this guy could really move 48 squares. So he could move from Norfolk to Virginia, following the rail line there, right up to Petersburg, and get right into the siege. Now, when you're on rail, you can't be attacked or attack. It's just a strategic movement. And a simple rule, just using a rail counter, but it worked. That's one of the things I liked about these 1973 games. Simple but effective. There isn't a lot more I can say about the game, except that to discover the magic of it, you have to play it. Now, there's almost a whole other sub-game going on in the Valley, too, because Early, Division Leader Early, Confederate, can be detached and sent into the Valley to bother Union forces and take pressure off of Richmond. So there's a whole sub-game going on in the Shenandoah Valley, which is kind of neat, too, affecting the whole campaign. I guess I can show the rules. They weren't very complicated in those days. SPI used a folder format, so we're talking, just a sheet folded up, not the kind of thick rule booklets you get today. So it was not a complicated game by any means, but certainly a good one. The charts were on this large sheet. The combat results table were particularly good. I thought they really reflected the Civil War at the time of 1864 with the entrenchments, almost prefiguring World War I combat, actually. So you actually had 3 different tables depending on the size of the defender. You had your cavalry probe chart over here, which is very simple, and the cavalry versus cavalry combat. I didn't mention the supply effects, which were very important in the game. Simple, but very, very effective. You had to keep your supply lines open. If you didn't, and they were cut in half, well, you were halved in combat, offensively and defensively. So the supply, though simple, certainly was effective. There's the time record scale. Each turn represented about 2 days, and you're representing the months of May 3rd, and the campaign ended on July 30th. So you're covering the periods of the Battle of the Wilderness, the Battle of Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and the ghastly siege of Petersburg. So it covered the whole campaign of 1864 in the East. So that's an overview of the Wilderness Campaign. I just can't seem to say enough good things about this game. You really have to play it to enjoy it. And if you get the chance to, get a copy on eBay or something for cheap, by all means get it. I think if you're a Civil War buff, you'll really like it. Now, the game was successful enough that SPI did do a sequel, Lee at Gettysburg, which they later renamed Lee Moves North. Now, I've got that game too, and perhaps I'll do a review of that one. They tweaked some little things in it, but it's basically the same game, and maybe we'll take a look at that sometime. So that's it for Wilderness Campaign, Lee vs. Grant, 1864, designed by SPI in 1973, and I give it a very high mark. I'd say, 8 out of 10. Very good game.